Jon Snow stood upon the ramparts of Castle Black, his gloved hands gripping the cold stone as he gazed out over the endless stretch of white that surrounded the wall. The wind was calm that evening, whispering only faintly, carrying the quiet hush of approaching dusk. It would be dark soon, though it was difficult to tell amidst the constant gloom of winter's approach. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, whipped around his pale face, and his eyes, gray and haunted, seemed fixed on something beyond the horizon. There, in the biting cold and the dimming light, he contemplated the impossible. He thought of the loyalties that bound him, of oaths and honor and the fragments of trust he had begun to form with the free folk who lived beyond the wall. But a flicker of uncertainty ghosted across his features, for another notion had taken root in his mind. A hunger for power, for the means to stop the long night by any method, and the idea that perhaps righteousness alone might not save them. If he could amass enough power, real, tangible power, perhaps he could conquer not just the cold and the undead, but all of Westeros, forging it into something unassailable. He had always been haunted by the limitations of his station. As a steward in the Night's Watch, a bastard of Winterfell, a man who never quite belonged anywhere, he lived in the margins. Yet, he had risen to become Lord Commander, forging alliances, making choices for the greater good. Still, in dark moments, the memory of being overlooked, and the gnawing sense that he was always one mistake away from being cast aside, ate at him. Honor was a bedrock upon which he built his life, and duty was the other. But these days, duty to the realm felt heavier than ever, and the threat beyond the wall loomed so large that it eclipsed every simpler notion of right and wrong. He tried to recall the day he bent the rules for the sake of the free folk, letting them pass through the wall to save them from the White Walkers and the encroaching undead threat had felt right. He had done it because of empathy, because they were living people, not monsters, and he had seen the horrors that lay in store for them if they were left to fend for themselves beyond the safety of the wall. Many brothers in the Watch had considered it a betrayal of everything the Night's Watch stood for. To Jon, it had seemed necessary. Yet, in the weeks and months since, he had faced the consequences of that choice. The mistrust, the silent stares, the clandestine whispers among the Black brothers, and the open hostility from knights and lords across the north. They saw him as a traitor or, at best, as a young fool who had let emotion conquer duty. That sense of being on a razor's edge, torn between what was good and what was necessary, had driven him to this new, treacherous idea. The free folk had begun to trust him, some of them absolutely. Tormund Giantsbane regarded him as a true friend, one who had risked everything to keep them safe. Many of them had started to believe that Jon Snow was unique, a crow in black clothing but with the heart of a free man. They wanted to stand at his side, fight for him if it came to it, repay their debt by defending the wall against the White Walkers. But what if Jon used that trust, that unshakable faith, for something else entirely? What if, instead of letting them integrate and become allies to the realm, he turned them into an army at his command to crush his enemies and claim a power that no one could challenge? He had parted ways with Stannis Baratheon's cause, had refused any notion of kingship for himself when it was brought up in hushed tones. But it stayed in the back of his mind. He was Ned Stark's son, or so he believed, and Ned Stark had royal Targaryen blood coursing through his veins only if the rumors about R+L=J were more than whispers. Even if Jon did not entirely believe the rumor of his parentage, it had lodged itself in his heart as a possibility. And with enough power, might he be able to unite or subjugate the whole realm quickly enough to face the coming winter as one unstoppable force? Honor demanded that he never even consider such a betrayal of trust, but the dark thoughts had taken hold. For the sake of winning a war against the Night King, for the sake of saving the realm, who was to say that a betrayal in the short term was not the lesser evil? He tried to breathe through the swirling doubts. He turned away from the wall, from the silent vastness of the haunted forest beyond. In his chambers, lit by a single tallow candle, he spent long nights wrestling with the conflicting impulses in his soul. Ghost, his dire wolf, watched him with ember-red eyes that never seemed to blink. Those eyes were the only comfort he had left. Ghost sensed the turmoil but remained wordless, a silent judge of all that Jon considered. John remembered how Tormund's laughter rumbled in the small hall near the common area, how the fiery bearded man clapped him on the shoulder, proclaiming him the best crow he'd ever known. The phrase returned, ironically, time and again. He wondered if Tormund would still call him friend if he knew of the plan that was forming in Jon's head. More than once, Jon tried to banish the thoughts, but they came back, relentless. He thought of how the Northern Lords had turned against him, how the Lord Commander's cloak hung heavily on his shoulders. He was tired of dancing on the edge of a knife between duty to the Watch and duty to the realm. Perhaps it was time to break free of that burden by forging a new path, one carved with blood and shadow. It started with small steps. He began to train more vigorously, to drill in secret with some of the wildling warriors who had skill with axes and spears, not just swords. He told them he wanted to learn their methods so that the Night's Watch could better adapt in the inevitable conflict with the others. They believed him. Why shouldn't they? Jon had already demonstrated an open mind. Sometimes he asked them about the old gods beyond the wall, about strange powers rumored to dwell in the heart of the winter wastelands. He remembered hearing talk of wargs, skin changers, of giants, and the silent children of the forest. He asked them about bone magic, about the artifacts carved from weirwood and something older than weirwood. Such questions drew raised eyebrows but not outright suspicion. Men like Tormund shrugged. He teased Jon for being too curious. But other free folk, those who lived closer to the gloom of the Frostfangs, looked at him with a quiet respect. They told half-tales of a hidden grove of ancient trees where men could bargain with old spirits for boons of might and foresight, though the price was always steep. Jon listened carefully, storing every scrap of rumor away. Something was starting to crystallize in his mind. A method to gather power, an unimaginable power that might eclipse petty allegiances. The first time Jon ventured beyond the wall after the wildlings had passed safely through was under the cover of a resupply expedition. He took Ghost, Tormund, and a handful of Night's Watch men who still trusted him wholeheartedly. They told the brothers that they were scouting for white movements, ensuring there was no sudden infiltration. As the party moved north, the wind grew sharper, the terrain bleaker. It felt as though the very earth rebelled against their presence, for these were lands of myth and silence. Still, Jon pressed onward, wanting to glimpse these hidden places the wildlings had spoken of. Though Tormund was by his side, Jon never fully revealed the depth of his desire or the reasons behind his quest. He only said he was looking for vantage points and secret paths that might prove essential if the others struck at them by surprise. Their band skirted the edge of a ravine. The sky was bone white, and the few sparse evergreens stood black and stunted. They made camp in a hollow near the ravine's lip, setting a watch at every corner, for the memory of white attacks had not diminished. Over a small fire, Tormund told stories about Mance Rayder, about the nights they sang in the wilderness, about how the free folk had come together under one king beyond the wall. He spoke, too, of how Jon had helped them in Hardhome and how they would not forget. Tormund's voice was low, almost reverent. That trust made Jon's heart ache. He stared at the dancing flames, feeling the weight of Tormund's loyalty like a chain. He could no longer tell if his plan was righteous or damned. A part of him still whispered that if he had to sacrifice loyalty or friendships to save the realm, then it must be done. Another part, the younger Jon Snow who once believed fiercely in honor, reeled in horror at what he was contemplating. That night, while Ghost kept watch, Jon did not sleep well. His dreams were a swirl of images. The face of a weirwood tree with crimson-sapped tears, the roars of giants, the clang of steel in an endless winter battlefield, and a haunting laughter that echoed from the ancient shadows. When dawn came, such as it was, for the sky remained a pearly gray, Jon rose and continued his scouting. They found a small wooden idol carved from weirwood, left by some unknown traveler or perhaps a follower of ancient gods. That night, alone, Jon sat cross-legged in the snow, turned the idol in his hands and closed his eyes. He tried to pray to the old gods, or to anything that might be listening in these desolate lands. He felt a resonance in the wood, as though it contained a fragment of a greater presence. A subtle stirring of air caressed his face, and for a moment, he thought he heard a distant voice. But then it faded. When Tormund found him, Jon merely stashed the idol away, saying it might be of interest to the Watch. Tormund shrugged, unconcerned. Over the following weeks, Jon orchestrated more such expeditions, sometimes with Tormund, sometimes with other trusted parties. He gathered bone trinkets and scraps of legends from elders among the free folk. All around Castle Black, rumors circulated that Jon was seeking further ways to strengthen the defense of the wall, preparing for a final confrontation with the Night King. Many found this wise or even heroic. A select few, Melisandre, for one, seemed to notice something in Jon's eyes, a distant flicker that hadn't been there before. Melisandre approached him once in the courtyard, her red robes fluttering around her as she studied his face in the gray morning light. "You have changed, Jon Snow," she said in that soft, eerie voice. "I see shadows around you. Your flame has grown darker, and yet it burns higher." He could not bring himself to trust her, nor to confide in her. So he simply stated that the war to come would demand new strengths from them all. She inclined her head, but her eyes were intense, as though they probed the hidden corners of his soul. She talked of the Lord of Light, of how prophecy might yet be fulfilled by those who seized their destinies. Jon said little in response. He knew she might be dangerous, or could be an ally if she found out about his pursuit of power, but he could not risk her interfering or twisting his aims. Days turned into weeks. Plans formed in secret. Jon's visits to the wildling camps grew more frequent. He learned who among them dealt in arcane stories, who believed in the hidden magics of the far north. He found a half-blind crone who spoke of a place deep in the Frostfang Mountains, a black cave overshadowed by a crooked weirwood tree, where a spirit of the old gods was said to dwell. "Blood begets power," the crone had hissed at him. "Power begets blood. Circle without end." Tormund heard only fragments of this conversation. Jon told him it was harmless nonsense, but the image lodged in Jon's mind. A black cave, a crooked weirwood, a presence that might grant the power he sought if he was willing to pay the price. He stared at that mental image late into the nights. The more he weighed it, the more it seduced him. Could this be a way to harness greater strength than any living man possessed? Could it be the key to forging an unstoppable force from the free folk, from the Watch, from any who might bend the knee once they saw Jon Snow wielding the might of something beyond mortal comprehension? He did not know if it was real, or if it would work, but the craving had sunk its claws into him. The honorable side of him tried to recoil in disgust, to tell him that no good could come from forging pacts with dark powers. But the memory of Hardhome, of the undead rising as the Night King lifted his arms, overshadowed Jon's sense of caution. The others were unstoppable if men played by the rules. Maybe the only way to outmaneuver them was to break those rules entirely. He made up his mind to go there. He spent weeks gathering supplies, forging an excuse to undertake an extensive patrol into the Frostfangs with a contingent of both Watch brothers and free folk. He carefully selected those who would come, men loyal to him personally, men who would follow him without question. Tormund, inevitably, was among them, for to exclude him would raise suspicion. And part of Jon still believed Tormund might understand, might see the necessity, if only he explained it correctly. They set out in early morning, the sky a harsh slate overhead, with light snow drifting sideways in the wind. The journey through the winding passes was arduous. The mountains loomed tall, treacherous, and the cold was a living thing that sought to drain warmth from their bones. But they pressed on, spurred by a sense of grim purpose. Ghost ranged ahead silently, occasionally returning with bits of frozen prey or warnings of ice-laden trails. The group had to contend with roving wights on two separate occasions, small bands of undead that they dispatched with practiced efficiency. But those skirmishes only reminded Jon of the unstoppable tide that lay behind them. The deeper they went into the Frostfangs, the more Jon felt something intangible pressing on his mind. The wind had a voice, a faint whisper that sounded almost like chanting in a language older than men. At length they found the place. A ravine overshadowed by a crooked weirwood, the bark twisted and ancient, as though shaped by centuries of howling wind. Its limbs were bleached bone, and the carved face in its trunk wore a tormented expression, tears of red sap glistening like fresh blood. Beyond it, the ravine opened into a gaping maw in the earth, the entrance to a cave that reeked of stale air and something indefinably uncanny. As soon as John laid eyes on it, he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The men around him stirred uneasily. Tormund glowered at the cave. "This place gives me a chill that sets my teeth on edge, John. We're better off scouting elsewhere." John shook his head, trying to sound resolute. "We push forward. The White Walkers have nests even in the darkest corners. If we leave this cave unsearched, we risk a surprise from behind." There were uneasy nods. They respected John as a leader. They followed him in. Their torches sputtered, painting wavering shadows along damp stone walls. The floor slanted downward, the darkness thick with a tang of iron and rot. As they went deeper, they found old bones scattered in crevices, the remains of animals or humans long dead. A hush fell upon them, broken only by the drip of water. Even Tormund, who was usually boisterous and unafraid, kept silent. John felt his heart pounding. A part of him, the part that still clung to the old ways of honor, wanted to turn back. But he forced himself onward. At length, the tunnel opened into a cavern. The torchlight revealed a domed ceiling, dripping with stalactites. The floor was uneven, and along one wall, there was a massive weirwood root snaking through the stone, as if the tree above had thrust its limbs deep into the bowels of the earth. The bark glimmered wetly. He felt something watching him, something that saw through his mortal eyes into the darkest corners of his intent. The men muttered among themselves. Ghost growled low, the fur on his neck bristling. Tormund turned to John. "There's nothing good in here, Crow. Let's go." John knew that if they left now, he might never again find the nerve to return. This was the place the crone had spoken of. This was his chance. But he needed a reason to remain. He tried to mask his urgency by gesturing to the far side of the cavern. "We'll do a quick search for any hidden passages. There may be clues about the White Walkers or their thralls." They spread out. Meanwhile, John discreetly examined the weirwood root. If the stories were to be believed, some kind of bargain or ritual had to be enacted here. But he had no idea what form it should take. He pressed his palm against the root, feeling a faint vibration. The bark was cold and slick. For a moment, he thought he heard a voice whisper his name, but it was too soft to be certain. Time was running out. The men were restless. If he was to do something, it had to be now. Shaking with a mixture of anticipation and dread, John surreptitiously drew a small knife from his belt. He glanced around to see if anyone was watching. All were busy peering into nooks, uneasy but following orders. John pressed the blade to his palm, wincing as he sliced it open, drawing blood. He let the crimson droplets fall onto the root's surface. It hissed faintly, or was that just the drip of water behind him? The entire cavern seemed to tense. He whispered under his breath, "If there is power here, I ask for it. I offer a life in return." The vow escaped him before he fully realized what he was saying. His heart hammered, but the hunger in him, the desperate need to protect the realm, even if it meant going beyond all moral bounds, drove him on. He felt a strange warmth radiate from the root. The darkness around him deepened, the torchlight flickering wildly. He thought he heard a voice, ancient and cold. "Power! For life!" A shout echoed across the cavern. One of the men had spotted John's bloodied hand upon the root. Tormund rushed over, alarm lighting his eyes. "John, what are you doing?" All at once, the root writhed. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A terrible groaning sound issued from the walls, and a gust of frigid wind snuffed most of the torches. Chaos erupted. Men cried out, stumbling in the sudden gloom. Ghosts snarled at shadows that seemed to come alive. In the near darkness, John felt the root twist beneath his hand, biting into his palm as if tasting the blood. He bit back a cry of pain. The voice that was not a voice slithered across his consciousness. "Life, for power choose." Blinking sweat from his eyes, John turned to see Tormund at his side, trying to pull him away from the twisting root. Tormund gripped Jon's shoulder. "We have to get out of here." That was when the necessity of sacrifice rose within Jon like a black tide. Life for power, the spirit demanded. But whose life? The voice whispered, "Betray one who trusts you best, and your cause shall gain the strength of old gods." A swirl of fragmented images bombarded Jon's mind. Scenes of an unstoppable army of free folk at his command. The realm bending the knee, the White Walkers shattered by his new power. Tormund's face loomed in his thoughts. Tormund who believed in him. Tormund who had become his dearest friend among the free folk. A flash of guilt tore at Jon's chest, but it battled with an unholy conviction that this was necessary. He thought of the thousands of lives lost at Hardhome, of the creeping terror of the Night King. Then, with a shaky breath, he made his choice. He turned abruptly on Tormund, who was trying to pull him to safety, and drove the small knife into Tormund's side. Tormund's eyes went wide, dispelly, yet warring with agony. The instant the blade slid between his ribs, the entire cavern seemed to shudder. A keening wail filled the darkness, as though the weirwood root screamed in triumph or despair. Torchlight flared again, showing Tormund collapsing to his knees, blood staining the front of his furs. Jon's own hand shook so violently that he dropped the knife, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The rest of the men froze in horror, uncertain what they had just witnessed. Jon half expected them to rise up against him that moment. Instead, a sudden rush of blackness swirled around Jon, as if drawn from the cavern walls, coalescing into a silent storm that wreathed him. Thunder clapped overhead, though they were deep under the earth. Then, with a sickening pulse, the darkness surged into Jon's body. His back arched, and he let out a ragged cry. Power, searing, cold, ancient, flooded through his veins, filling every fiber of his being with a terrible strength. For a moment, all was chaos and screams. Tormund lay gasping, eyes fixed on Jon in betrayed confusion. Ghost howled in rage and fear, bounding to Tormund's side, whining. The men pressed themselves to the cavern walls, some dropping their weapons, as if the entire place had become cursed. Jon staggered, drunk on this sudden rush of might, his mind struggling to contain it. He felt something swirl behind his eyes. Knowledge of old runes, the language of the forest, the means to bend lesser wills. He realized that Tormund still clung to life, trembling as he stared at Jon. The horror in Tormund's eyes cut deeper than any sword ever could. But the power was there, coursing, demanding the final stroke of betrayal. Jon took up his sword, Longclaw, with a hand that still shook. He pressed the blade to Tormund's chest. Tormund's lips shaped a question, "Why?" But no sound came out. Before Jon's own sanity could stop him, he drove Longclaw downward, ending Tormund's life. It felt as though a final seal was broken. The cavern grew eerily quiet, no longer trembling. All eyes were on Jon. Some men were too shocked to react. One or two started to lower spears to brandish them in fear. But Jon stood among them like a figure of living night, eyes darkened, voice resonating with something inhuman. "Lay down your arms," Jon commanded. His voice echoed unnaturally. "Follow me, and you will live." In that moment, it was as if the men lost any will to fight him. This went beyond simple fear. It was a compulsion. The darkness swirling in Jon's veins reached out to them in intangible waves, stifling their rebellious thoughts. They stared, some trembling, some with tears in their eyes, but they set their weapons down. Ghost did not obey. He still crouched by Tormund's lifeless body, baring his fangs at Jon. That betrayal cut Jon's heart anew, but he couldn't let the direwolf oppose him. Slowly, he met Ghost's red-eyed glare. He willed the new power to quell the direwolf's hostility. Ghost shuddered, whining, but still bared his teeth, resisting whatever hold this darkness tried to exert. For the moment, Jon let Ghost be. Perhaps a part of him still loved that animal too much to destroy him. What followed was a slow, grim walk back out of the cave, Tormund's body left behind in a pool of blood. None dared speak of what happened. The men carried something sharper than fear. They had witnessed the unthinkable. Jon Snow, the man who had once saved them, turning on his truest friend among the free folk. They had seen him claim some fell power in the process. They were too terrified to challenge him, and they were too bound by some unknown sorcery to flee. In the days that followed, Jon learned how to refine that power, how to quiet their memories, how to weave a loyalty born of fear and enchantment. Some grew docile, subservient. Others, who were stronger-willed, cowered but could not fully bring themselves to speak out. Ghost stayed near the edges of the camp, never meeting Jon's gaze, always watchful. Jon felt the direwolf's mistrust like a splinter in his mind. He regretted killing Tormund, felt the slow poison of guilt gnawing at his gut. But each time the guilt threatened to break him, the power thrumming in his veins reminded him why he had done it. For the sake of the realm. There was no turning back. When the company returned to Castle Black, Jon wore an air of command that few had seen in him before. Some recognized it as confidence, others as a strange, frightening aura that made their skin crawl. Word spread that Tormund Giantsbane had died in a skirmish with whites, that Jon had tried to save him but failed. The men who had accompanied him did not contradict the story. They nodded numbly, their eyes hollow. The free folk mourned Tormund's loss. They wept and cursed the darkness beyond the wall. Jon stood among them, head bowed, receiving their condolences, but inside, that cold voice whispered, "They will kneel. In time, they will do more than kneel. They will become my sword and shield." Slowly, he began to gather them in training fields, instructing them to form into battalions, to adopt a new hierarchy. Most did so willingly enough, believing that Jon Snow, the friend of the free folk, was preparing them for the final confrontation with the White Walkers. Only a handful sensed a shift in Jon's demeanor, an intensity in his eyes that wasn't there before. They chalked it up to the tragedy of Tormund's death. If the men who had witnessed it in the cave tried to speak up, Jon found them alone, gazed into their eyes, and uttered words that seized their minds in an iron grip. It was a subtle magic, but potent, and he used it sparingly, lest Melisandre or others detect what he had become. One by one, potential dissidents were silenced or brought under his thrall. Within a fortnight, Jon commanded a sizable force of disciplined free folk, far more organized than their unstructured tribes had ever been. The Night's Watch regarded this development with a mix of suspicion and relief. Some of the Black Brothers were wary of how subservient these wild men had become. Others saw the advantage in having well-structured allies. Ser Alliser Thorne, ever distrustful, glowered from corners and muttered about the unnaturalness of it all. Yet, even he held his tongue, because it was undeniable that the defenses of the wall had never been stronger. And it was not just the free folk. Jon had begun to exert subtle manipulations on his own brothers as well. Here and there, he would test the boundaries of the dark power that dwelled in him. A quiet word, a fixing of his piercing gaze, and men who once questioned him now agreed or at least found themselves too uncertain to argue. It was not the total dominion he seemed to achieve with the free folk, but it was enough. He was forging a new Night's Watch, one that answered to him above all. He learned also that the power required occasional sacrifices, blood to feed the hungry presence that lived inside him. The old gods, or whatever dark spirit he had awakened, demanded it. Late at night, when the corridors of Castle Black were quiet, Jon would slip into the cells where unruly or violent criminals were kept. He would whisper to them in the darkness, and their screams would be stifled by the cold night. The next morning, the cells would be empty, and no one remembered exactly who had been taken. Each sacrifice tightened Jon's hold on the armies he was building, gave him surges of renewed strength and control. Each time, Jon felt his moral self erode further, replaced by a singular purpose. Unify the North, crush the White Walkers, and bend the entire realm to a single will strong enough to stand against the undead. The storms of winter were growing fiercer, and reports of White Walker sightings became more frequent. The next step in Jon's plan was to call a meeting of the Northern Lords, to show them the reformed alliance he had cultivated between the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, and to invite them to pledge their support. Messages went out, carried by black ravens. Many lords were hesitant, still mistrusting the notion that wildlings could be reliable allies. But the threat of the others, combined with the fervor of the loyal Black brothers who conveyed Jon's entreaties, persuaded them to come and see. The watchers on the wall stood proud, ready to demonstrate their might. When the lords and their retinues arrived at Castle Black, they beheld lines of free folk soldiers drilling in the courtyard, outfitted in a mixture of black leathers and furs, saluting Jon Snow as if he were some king. They saw the disciplined columns, the sure-footed maneuvers. In the great hall, Jon received each lord with a courtesy that belied the underlying tension. Many recognized something different in him. His gaze was colder, more assertive. The subtle hush among the men and women who looked upon him suggested they felt a weight in the air. Lord Wyman Manderly, who had once been fiercely protective of the Starks and the North's traditions, approached Jon carefully. "Lord Commander," he said, eyeing the black cloak on Jon's shoulders, "I can't deny that you've done wonders in forging these wild men into an army, but I worry what cost it took." Jon offered a thin smile that did not touch his eyes. "They are free folk, my lord, not wild men. They are our first line of defense against the horrors that lurk beyond the wall. The cost is necessity, and I have no desire to break faith with the North, but we must unify if we are to stand against the Night King. Are you with us?" Manderly glanced around, noting the formidable presence of this newly formed alliance. Perhaps he felt the swirling pressure of that dark aura around Jon, or perhaps the old man simply believed no other choice existed. He gave a curt nod. "Very well, Lord Commander. The Manderlys will stand with you." One by one, the other lords followed suit, some with resignation, some with genuine relief. And each time Jon clasped their hands, he exerted a tiny thread of compulsion, ensuring their loyalty. It was not as powerful as what he could do to the free folk, but it planted seeds of compliance. Gradually, a broad alliance took shape. They recognized Jon Snow as the de facto leader of the Night's Watch and the huge army that had grown around it. Word spread through the North that a united force was rallying behind the wall, forging an offensive plan to strike out against the White Walkers before they marched too far south. Melisandre watched all of this from the shadows, her red eyes ever fixed on Jon. She sensed a power in him, yes, but not the flame of R'hllor. It was colder, older, and she could not interpret the visions the flames gave her. She tried to approach Jon, to persuade him that the Lord of Light was the only path to victory, but Jon deftly brushed aside her insinuations. He had no need for her fire magic, for he had touched something more primal. She grew uneasy. Several times, she considered using her own powers to pry deeper, but she hesitated. The men of the Watch revered Jon. The free folk worshipped him as a savior, and the northern lords had thrown their weight behind him. Perhaps, Melisandre mused, he truly was Azor Ahai, though not in the way she had expected. When the time came for a direct confrontation, Jon's armies marched north of the wall. Countless free folk, supplemented by northern knights and men-at-arms, along with the entire fighting strength of the Night's Watch, trudged through snow and ice, forging a path toward the heart of the White Walkers' domain. The decision to go on the offensive was bold, unorthodox, but Jon insisted they meet the threat head-on. Many whispered that marching into the darkness was folly, but Jon's mesmerizing certainty swayed them. Soldiers who would have otherwise questioned the order found themselves nodding in agreement, hearts pounding with a strange mixture of fear and devotion. With each mile they traveled beyond the wall, the temperature dropped further. The wind wailed like a chorus of lost souls. The sky rarely cleared, perpetually choked by swirling snow that reduced the daylight to a bleak haze. At the head of the column, Jon wore a cloak of darkest sable. Longclaw sat at his hip, and an eerie black aura seemed to cling to him. Occasionally, men flinched when he passed, feeling as though something brushed their souls. Ghost still trailed behind, silent and suspicious, always watching his former master with the sorrowful knowledge of one who had seen the terrible truth. Scouts reported sightings of undead ahead, a writhing mass of whites, a scattering of pale figures that could only be White Walkers. Jon pressed on, forging a plan. When they reached a wide, frozen lake that lay beneath steep hills, they decided to make their stand there. The undead were close. If they set up a defensive perimeter with sharpened stakes and pits, they might funnel the oncoming horde into a kill zone. Jon deployed the Free Folk archers on higher ground, placed Northern Knights at choke points, and sprinkled the Black Brothers with dragonglass-tipped spears among the ranks. It was a carefully laid trap. But behind the strategy, Jon also nurtured a deeper objective: to test his newly acquired powers against the White Walkers themselves. If he could overcome them here, his claim to authority over the entire realm would be undeniable. The battle began in late afternoon when the first lines of Whites lurched into view, a hideous tide of rotting flesh and blue eyes. Archers unleashed volleys of arrows fitted with dragonglass points. Dozens of Whites fell, dissolving in eerie shrieks. But more came. The White Walkers skulked at the edges of the horde, their crystalline swords gleaming. They commanded the undead like generals in a ghostly army. Jon rode forward, flanked by a small guard of Free Folk cavalry, horses they had acquired from the Northern Lords. As the lines clashed, screams filled the air. Swords shattered undead bones. The Whites clawed and bit, trying to drag men down. The White Walkers advanced with terrible grace, freezing the very air around them. Jon spurred his mount, cutting through knots of Whites with savage efficiency. He felt the darkness in his veins whisper encouragement, stoking his bloodlust. His men roared, driven by fear and devotion, following him into the fray. At last, Jon confronted a White Walker at the center of the field, icy mist swirling around them. Longclaw met the Walker's blade in a clash that sent sparks of frost dancing in the air. Jon felt the shock of it reverberate through his arms. But then the dark power surged, lending him strength. He pressed forward, forcing the Walker to yield ground. The creature's pale eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, it seemed uncertain, as though sensing something in Jon that was akin to the magic that bound it. With a furious cry, Jon channeled that power, pushing it through Longclaw, and the Walker's weapon shattered in a spray of ice shards. The Walker let out a shriek and dissolved. A triumphant roar went up from Jon's forces as they saw him slay the White Walker. He felt their adoration, their awe feeding him. More White Walkers advanced, but now Jon was a storm of dark fury on the battlefield. He bent the shadows, swirling them around him, disorienting the undead. Men rallied to him, fighting with renewed vigor. The White Walkers tried to raise new Whites from the fallen, but each time they attempted it, Jon would focus that presence within him and disrupt their hold, momentarily severing their control. It was not permanent, but it was enough for his army to gain ground. By twilight, the undead were in disarray, retreating into the snow. The White Walkers vanished into the gloom, leaving behind countless shattered Whites. The field was littered with bodies of the living and the dead. Steam rose from patches of disturbed snow. The wind carried the moans of the mortally wounded. Yet victory was theirs, a victory that seemed impossible but for the unnatural might Jon Snow had unleashed. Men cheered his name, exalting him as the savior of the North, the one who could strike terror into the White Walkers. Some called him king in the North. Others whispered that perhaps the Iron Throne itself should be his, for who else could lead the Seven Kingdoms against the threat of the Long Night? Standing amid the carnage, flecks of dried blood on his face, Jon felt the rush of power and the heady intoxication of adoration. He closed his eyes, hearing the men chant. The darkness within him purred contentedly. In that moment, he knew there would be no returning to the humble, honorable Jon he once was. He had tasted what it was like to be revered, to be feared, and to stand above all others. As the ragged army regrouped, Jon announced that the White Walkers were wounded, but not vanquished. They must press onward, deeper into the lands of always winter, to deliver a final blow before the undead could recover. The men obeyed, though many were exhausted. They followed him with blind faith. No longer did they speak of returning south to rest or to protect their families. They were enthralled by the possibility of stamping out the others once and for all, led by a commander they believed to be touched by divine might. In the days that followed, their forces marched into a darkness beyond anything they had known, a realm of perpetual twilight of frozen spires and hidden ravines. The temperature plummeted further with each league. Food grew scarce, morale wore thin, but Jon's presence compelled them onward, instilling in them a grim determination. They fought more pockets of whites and lesser White Walkers, always emerging victorious, though each battle claimed more lives. Jon took no pleasure in the needless death, but he steeled himself by reminding his conscience of the greater cause. At times, Melisandre approached him, seeking to glean how he was accomplishing these feats. He gave her vague answers about harnessing the power of the old gods, about forging a new path that even R'hllor could not overshadow. She did not seem satisfied, but she dared not confront him openly. Fear flickered in her crimson eyes, for she sensed that the darkness in Jon was ancient and had no love for her fiery deity. Eventually, they reached the cusp of the heart of winter, a barren expanse of ice fields and jagged ridges, where the Night King himself was rumored to dwell. There, beneath an eerie aurora shimmering in the starless sky, Jon's vanguard clashed with the largest host of undead yet assembled. The Night King appeared on an ice shelf overlooking the field, flanked by tall, gaunt White Walkers mounted on undead horses. His eyes burned a vivid cerulean, and he gazed down at Jon Snow. A hush fell across both armies. Jon advanced, sword in hand, pushing aside the illusions of courtesy or negotiation. There would be none. The final confrontation had come. The Night King raised one hand, and the entire ice field trembled. A fissure split the ground, and from that yawning crack emerged monstrous wights. Giants, bears, abominations stitched together by ice and death. The living soldiers quailed, but Jon roared, "Hold your ground!" They obeyed, quivering under the compulsion of his voice. Then the battle began in earnest. It was a carnage beyond any previous skirmish. Men were torn limb from limb by undead giants. The free folk archers poured volley after volley of dragonglass arrows into the horde. Knights charged valiantly, only to be overwhelmed by the endless tide of wights. Jon waded into the thick of it, black aura crackling around him, slaying monsters left and right. Each time a man fell, he felt a pang, but he pressed on, ignoring the screams. His destiny lay in confronting the Night King. Took time, countless minutes or perhaps hours of brutal fighting, but Jon carved a path to the foot of the ice shelf. With supernatural agility, he climbed the jagged slope, dragging himself up onto the plateau where the Night King waited, his White Walker guards forming a silent phalanx. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw, the fur on his cloak caked with ice. He locked eyes with the Night King, who stared back with a cold malevolence. The White Walkers advanced, but Jon summoned the swirling darkness. Shadows lashed out, disorienting and slowing them. Dragonglass-laced fury radiated from Jon's blade. He cut down one White Walker, then another, each shrieking in ephemeral rage before dissolving into shards of ice. Now only Jon and the Night King remained. The air crackled with tension. Far below, the armies continued their deadly dance. But this was the true confrontation. Jon lunged. The Night King parried with his ice spear, the collision sending a shockwave through the ice. Jon staggered but regained his footing, hurling all his might into the next blow. The power within him howled, as though it recognized its kin in the Night King's magic, both ancient and merciless. The Night King hissed, thrusting the spear forward. Jon twisted aside, swinging Longclaw in a downward arc. The blade bit deep into the ice spear, shattering it. The Night King recoiled, stumbling. Jon seized his chance, driving Longclaw at the Night King's heart. For an instant, the creature managed to grasp the blade with a hand wreathed in sub-zero frost. The steel began to frost over, but the dragonglass inlay glowed with a dark shimmer, repelling the cold. Jon roared, pushing forward, and Longclaw pierced the Night King's chest. A cacophony of cracking ice filled the air. The Night King's expression flickered from cruel confidence to what might have been fear. His form began to fracture, pale ice shards radiating outward from the wound. In that crucial moment, Jon felt an opening, a chance to do more than just slay the Night King. The darkness in him stirred, He realized he could siphon some of the Night King's power into himself, an even greater conquest of death than he had already achieved. The idea was immediate, seductive, unstoppable. He twisted the blade, imagining drawing the cold power through Longclaw and into his own body. A dreadful cry tore from the Night King's lips, echoing over the battlefield. Blue light flared in his eyes, then burst forth, coursing down the length of the blade. Jon gasped, nearly overwhelmed by the torrent of freezing energy that slammed into his chest. But the presence within him was ready, hungry. It devoured that power, absorbing it like a vortex. The Night King shattered, his essence pouring into Jon. Below, on the ice fields, the entire undead horde collapsed where it stood, the White Walkers dissolving into swirling snow, the Whites becoming motionless corpses. Victorious cheers rose from the living. They did not yet see what was happening high above them. On the shelf, Jon fell to his knees, trembling under the deluge of raw magic. It was an agony unlike anything he had experienced, burning cold scouring his veins. His vision dimmed. He thought he might die, that he might explode from the power too vast for one human to contain. But the spirit inside him, whatever ancient entity had inhabited the Weirwood Cave, guided and shaped the Night King's energy, binding it, forging it into something new. When it was done, Jon rose to his feet, breathing hard, steam curling from his lips. The wind had died around him, leaving a deep silence. He looked out at the battlefield. Thousands of men stared up at him, many on their knees, overcome by the miracle of the undead falling lifeless. Ghost stood on a ridge of ice, gazing up at Jon with a mournful, uncomprehending look. Jon lifted Longclaw in a gesture that signaled victory. A roar went up from his forces, echoing across the frozen plains. With the Night King destroyed, the greatest threat to the living had ended. The realm was saved from the long night, at least for now. But as Jon stood there, the swirling magic still crackling under his skin, he felt the truth. The power of death itself lingered in him. He was not just a man. He was something more, and something far more dangerous. In the days that followed, the battered army made its triumphant return south. Word raced ahead of them. The White Walkers were defeated, the Whites destroyed. Survivors hailed Jon Snow as a legendary hero. They called him the prince that was promised, the savior of Westeros, the one who banished the Long Night. Lords flocked to the cause, kneeling freely now, for he had proven that he alone had the power to vanquish the great darkness. He demanded they bend the knee to him personally, no longer content to be just Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. The realm, he declared, needed a single ruler to guide it through the reconstruction of winter's devastation. Those who hesitated to yield found themselves enthralled by his presence, or quietly removed. Castle Black became a seat of power unrivaled in the north. No longer bound by his vows, Jon named himself King of the North, anointing himself not with the authority of southern traditions but by the raw might he carried within. One by one, houses that had once pledged loyalty to the Starks, to the Targaryens, to the Baratheons, came under Jon Snow's dominion. Some he turned to his cause by demonstrating his formidable new abilities, dark illusions, commands no mortal could resist. Others simply saw an unassailable champion who saved them from the White Walkers. Sansa Stark, hearing the news from Winterfell, arrived with her retinue, uncertain what to make of her half-brother's ascent. She found Castle Black unrecognizable. Throngs of free folk, northern knights, and black brothers moving in strict order, all wearing a black sigil that combined the direwolf of Stark with a faint swirl of darkness around it. She greeted Jon with cautious warmth, but he embraced her, telling her that the days of House Stark were not ended, but transformed. He invited her to remain at his side, to help guide the North into a new era. She noticed the coldness in his eyes, the subtle menace lurking beneath his affectionate words. Yet, she was not certain how to oppose him, not after hearing the grand tales of how he single-handedly destroyed the Night King. In secret moments, Sansa confided her fears to those she trusted. Something had changed in Jon, something profound. She did not know about Tormund's murder or the unnatural blood sacrifices, but she saw the echoes of darkness. Whispers in the corridors spoke of men disappearing, secret rituals performed at night, and an iron-willed tyranny disguised as benevolent leadership. Soldiers patrolled with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. Jon, for his part, told himself that everything he did was still for the good of the realm. He needed to unify the entire continent if the realm was to withstand future threats. The Iron Throne was fractured, with multiple claimants still squabbling in the south. This chaos would only invite disaster in the future. So, he marched his consolidated northern army beyond the Neck, capturing Moat Cailin, forging alliances with or subduing the Riverlands. Houses that resisted his will found themselves swept aside by legions of enthralled warriors, or they discovered that their leaders were enthralled by a single, chilling gaze from Jon Snow. At the same time, Jon recognized that the old god's power required constant feeding. The spirit in him demanded more blood to sustain the bond, to stabilize the monstrous union of forces that had once been the Night Kings. Over time, his relationship with Ghost frayed. The dire wolf refused to accompany him on campaigns, slinking away whenever Jon approached. Once, Ghost growled in open defiance, baring teeth. Jon, in a fit of wrath, commanded Ghost to submit. When the wolf refused, Jon's aura flared with a sinister light, forcing Ghost to whimper and slink away, tail between his legs. The betrayal, repeated from that day in the cave, left Jon numb. The last vestige of his old self was slipping away. Eventually, the unstoppable tide reached King's Landing, battered from years of civil strife. News of the defeat of the White Walkers had preceded Jon. So many in the capital felt a mixture of relief and dread to see him approach with a massive northern host. The small council convened, uncertain whether to resist or yield. But when Jon arrived, they had little choice. He entered the city through the main gate, flanked by ranks of soldiers. The common folk, hearing stories of his miraculous victory in the far north, initially cheered him, hailing him as a liberator. Jon made a show of humility, bowing his head, stating he had come to bring stability and peace. Yet behind the scenes, every lord and knight of the city was given a single chance to bend the knee. Those who refused were removed. If they tried to rally forces to oppose him, Jon personally confronted them, using his dark powers to strip them of free will or to end them. In a matter of days, King's Landing surrendered. The old Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of melted swords, was his for the taking. Standing in the Red Keep's throne room, Jon gazed upon the Iron Throne. A bitter memory flitted through his mind. Eddard Stark, the man Jon had believed to be his father, once pledged loyalty to a man who sat on that throne. Jon had grown up a bastard, unacknowledged by the realm, forced to join the Night's Watch as a means of carving out a place for himself. How far he had come. The polished swords and twisted iron beckoned him. He ascended the steps, turned, and sat. The throng of courtiers, lords, and knights knelt before him in a wave of submission. The realm had a new king, Jon Snow, the slayer of the Night King, the conqueror of the living. He felt neither joy nor regret, only a profound sense of destiny fulfilled, and a grim certainty that he alone now bore the burden of protecting Westeros. The power he held was immeasurable. No one could stand against him. He would do what must be done. That same night, alone in the throne room, he pricked his finger on a jagged spike of the throne and let the blood drip onto the cold stone floor. He murmured to the old gods he had bound himself to, feeling the presence stir. The realm was his, he declared silently. Whatever monstrous acts it required to maintain unity, he would commit them. Time went on. The snows of winter retreated. The planting season returned. Common folk toiled under the watchful eye of soldiers bearing Jon's sigil, black as midnight. The roads were safer than they had been in decades, banditry crushed by soldiers who served their king with unshakable obedience. Food and supplies trickled north to rebuild the battered castles along the wall. Many praised Jon as the greatest monarch Westeros had ever seen. A man unafraid to use power to maintain order, to protect the small folk from chaos. Others, in whispered corners, called him the Shadow King, telling hushed stories of unnatural rituals and mind control, of disappearances and a stifling oppression. Sansa Stark lived in King's Landing as well, elevated to a position of prominence alongside Jon. She wore fine dresses, participated in royal court, but her eyes never lost that wariness. She had seen the changes in her brother, recognized that the shadow he carried was no mere rumor. She tried to speak with him sometimes to remind him of home, of the old values Ned Stark taught them. But Jon brushed her aside. He spoke in cryptic assurances that everything was for the greater good. More and more, she realized that no appeals to family or honor could pierce the armor of his resolve. And yet, to defy him openly was to risk a confrontation she knew she could not win. The people might love her as a Stark, but they feared and worshipped Jon in equal measure. In quieter moments, Jon would step out onto the Red Keep's balcony, looking north, as if drawn by an invisible tether to the place where his transformation began. Sometimes he dreamed of Tormund, remembering the man's hearty laugh, the genuine friendship they once shared. The dream would turn to a nightmare. Tormund's wide eyes staring up at him in disbelief, blood staining the cave floor. Jon would wake with his heart pounding, a bitter taste in his mouth. But with morning came the swirl of duties, the unending demands of a kingdom that needed a strong hand. His hold on the realm solidified. The Lord Paramounts in every region bent the knee. Dorne, the Vale, the Reach, the Stormlands, none dared oppose him. Occasionally, rebellion sparked among discontented lords who remembered a time when each region had more autonomy. Jon crushed these revolts swiftly, systematically. He gave them one chance to obey. If they refused, he marched in and subdued them, enthralling key leaders or publicly executing them, their blood feeding the old god's thirst. Each victory made him stronger, more unassailable. The only real check on his power was the memory of what happened north of the Wall. The White Walkers were gone, but the threat of the monstrous entity inside him remained. He sometimes wondered if he had merely traded one doomsday for another, that of a king who might, over time, become as cruel and unfeeling as the Night King himself. He took no pleasure in cruelty, but the lines between necessity and tyranny had long since blurred. Each sacrifice numbed him further. Yet the realm prospered in many ways. The roads were safe, the harvests distributed more evenly. The shrines to the old gods were rebuilt even in southern lands, forging a strange new religion that merged with the worship of the Seven. Some followed by choice, enthralled by the notion of a living king who had bested death. Others followed out of fear or because Jon's compulsion left them little choice. Over time, it became simply the new normal. Jon Snow, the living myth, the king of Westeros, champion of a dark power that had banished the greatest threat the world had known. And so it stood, year after year, as winter's end gave way to a cautious spring. He fathered no children, showing little interest in forging dynastic ties, for he knew the power lived in him alone and could not be passed through mere blood. His nights were often sleepless, prowling the corridors, the black cloak trailing behind him like living shadow. The old gods whispered in his ear of new expansions, new worlds beyond the Sunset Sea. But even Jon had no appetite for that. It was enough to maintain the unity of the Seven Kingdoms. Occasionally, he knelt before the twisted weirwood heart trees in the godswood of the Red Keep, a new addition he had demanded, transplanted from the north. Its face was a leering grimace, forever weeping red sap. He would place a hand on the trunk, feeling the echo of the cave that had changed him, feeling Tormund's blood still crying out. The power would murmur in response, cold and immortal. "You have everything you wanted," it seemed to say. "Why do you lament?" Jon never answered aloud, for fear his voice might break. He simply bowed his head, hearing the hush of the night, carrying the burden of his sins. It was a lonely reign, for none could truly stand by his side. His supporters worshipped him or feared him or both. Ghost had long since fled, running north, perhaps to the wild lands beyond the Wall. Sansa remained, a distant figure at court functions, drifting further from him emotionally with each passing year. Melisandre disappeared one night, her faith shattered or perhaps trying to seek out a new champion. Jon did not pursue her, let her wander. He had no fear of her illusions. In the end, the realm knew peace under his rule, An enforced peace, yes, but better than the chaos of constant war. The people ate. Trade flourished. The undead were a fading memory. And yet, whenever a man or woman stood in the hush of the night, looking up at the Red Keep's highest tower, they felt an unease, as though a cold wind blew even in the heart of summer. At times they saw a figure on the balcony, a lone king garbed in black, eyes reflecting no stars, only the darkness from within. He had saved them, but he had damned himself in the process. And for better or worse, all of Westeros belonged to Jon Snow, the man who betrayed the free folk and, by that betrayal, gained a power so immense that even winter itself had to bow to him. Yet beneath that power lay the awful truth, that in defeating the greatest enemy, he had become something else, a ruler whose might was absolute, whose rule was unbreakable, and whose isolation was as vast and cold as the eternal night he had once sought to prevent. Months turned into years, and the people adapted to this unearthly monarchy. They forgot the old wars, forgot the gentle ways of some kings and the fiery ways of others. They lived under the shadow of a king whose presence could make them tremble or weep in awe. Some argued it was a small price to pay for security. Others believed a day of reckoning would come, a day when the darkness that empowered Jon Snow would demand a heavier price. But for the time being, Westeros was united. In the quiet corners of the world, certain mystics speculated about the balance of power. If the Night King was gone, if the White Walkers were no more, might the underlying forces that governed life and death find another way to restore equilibrium? Jon's closeness to the old gods suggested that nature would not remain forever subdued. Even kings, no matter how mighty, faced the inevitability of time. The question that lingered was whether Jon's destiny would be to rule forever in darkness, or whether one day the realm would discover a new champion to stand against him. For the man himself, for Jon Snow, each dawn he awakened to the echo of Tormund's dying gaze, the memory of what he had sacrificed. He would banish it with the same cold logic that spurred him on from the beginning, that all of Westeros would have perished had he not seized the power. Had he not done what needed to be done, would they have survived the onslaught of the White Walkers? The answer to him was clear. He had saved them, and now, by fear and might, he bound them to peace. Yet that did little to quell the hollowness in his soul. His fate was sealed the moment he thrust a knife into his friend's side. The free folk, ironically, were the ones to suffer the greatest betrayal, for they had placed their hope in him. They had wanted to be free. Instead, they became the instruments of his ambition. Those who remained in the north still told stories around the fire of Tormund Giantsbane, the man who had brought them into the fold, only to be murdered by the one he trusted. They spoke softly, careful not to draw the attention of Jon's watchers. Though they reaped the benefits of living behind the wall, safe from the undead, they felt the weight of that safety. It was purchased in blood and sealed with a lost freedom. Over time, the story of Jon Snow's betrayal might become legend. Perhaps one day the truth would be twisted into a fable of a heroic king who saved the realm with no mention of the dark path he took. Or maybe the bards would whisper his name with trembling lips, recalling that sometimes the hero's crown is forged from the sharpest edges of treachery. In either case, the realm rested under a single banner, black as midnight, a dire wolf entwined with shadows, and a single name that rose from 1,000 tongues: Long live the king. For now, from his seat of power, from the vantage of an unassailable throne, Jon Snow gazed across the realm he had conquered. In his silent, darkest moments, he remembered a time when he was just a young man at the wall, believing in honor, in fae, lordship, in duty. That man was gone. In his place was a king, shaped by the old gods, haunted by the memory of a friend's last breath. The promise of safety for all Westeros lay in his hands, and so did the dread of what would happen if he ever faltered in feeding the insatiable power that girded his rule. Thus, the realm stood, balanced on the edge of a sword, saved from the terror of the dead at the cost of bending to a king as implacable and cold as the winter he had vanquished. The nights in King's Landing were never truly warm again. Some said that in the silence of the darkest hours, one could still hear the faint howl of a dire wolf echoing from the north, mourning the man who was lost to shadow and the friend he had slain for the sake of a crown. But if Jon Snow heard it, he gave no sign. He bore his kingdom with the same stoic determination he once gave to the Night's Watch, never acknowledging that his old self had died in that cave with Tormund Giantsbane. In his heart of hearts, he knew the truth. Some evils could be conquered only by becoming a different kind of monster. And so Westeros moved forward, bound together under a king who had betrayed the free folk, but in doing so, saved the world and sacrificed his soul. In the months following the moment Jon Snow first took his seat upon the Iron Throne, no one could recall the City of Kings landing so quiet, so orderly. Thousands of soldiers clad in black, their surcoats bearing an emblem that combined the stark direwolf with a curling shadow, patrolled the capital day and night. Where once there had been riots over bread or violent tavern brawls, there was an eerie calm. Merchants found trade routes safer than they had been in a century. Fishmongers and blacksmiths alike could ply their trades unharassed. Thieves and ruffians discovered quickly that King Jon's justice was swift and final, and that his very presence could force obedience from even the boldest cutthroat. Sentries posted at each gate recorded who left and who entered with an exacting eye, answerable to the king's men, and indirectly to Jon himself. Despite the surface prosperity, tension ran under the city's skin like a slow-moving sickness. The Red Keep loomed over the populace, stony and silent, its throne room perpetually guarded by an elite cadre of black-cloaked warriors. They were as disciplined as any soldiers the realm had ever seen, but behind their unblinking stares lurked something unnatural. Gossip ran that each man's will had been shaped by the king's own dark aura, that they no longer dared form private thoughts of rebellion. Others whispered that the king was a figure of prophecy, rightful heir to the entire continent. But more devout hearts, especially among those who still lit candles to the Seven, felt only unease. Men and women whose ancestors had prayed to the Seven scorned the new idols cropping up in corners of the city, small weirwood figurines with twisted faces carved onto them. The old gods had never been worshipped so far south in such large numbers before, and the speed at which these strange shrines spread made many uneasy. Jon was rarely seen outside the Red Keep, though when he did walk among the people, an unnatural hush followed him, as if the crowd were under a spell. He would stride down the cobbled streets, draped in a black cloak, his dark hair threaded through with a single streak of silver that had begun to appear since the day he absorbed the Night King's power. His face betrayed little emotion. He would greet a few of the local guild masters with curt acknowledgments, speak short reassurances that the city was prospering, and promise continued stability. The people would listen in awed silence, bowing as he passed. Then he would return to the keep, to that cold seat of monarchy he had claimed. No festivals greeted him, for the crowd's reverence was laced with fear. Sansa Stark watched all of this from the vantage of a woman who'd once known King's Landing as a lion's den filled with backstabbing courtiers. In a twisted irony, the city was now safer than it had ever been. There were no pointless intrigues, no warring factions. But the cost of such peace was a stranglehold on free will. Sansa spoke carefully with the lords and ladies who attended court, those who had once jockeyed for power under Tommen or Cersei. They, too, had quieted, their ambitions doused by the knowledge that King Jon could crush them with a glance. She tried to glean if there was any pocket of unforced loyalty or if everyone was simply going through the motions, terrified of crossing a king who might be more dangerous than any tyrant of old. As months turned to a year, the realm remained stable. The farmlands around the Crownlands produced a decent harvest despite the lingering chill in the air. Much of the devastation from previous wars had been repaired through the labor of countless small folk, who found themselves working double shifts under the watchful eye of the king's officers. To many commoners, a full belly and a safe road meant more than the abstract notion of liberty. Life was better for them than during the War of the Five Kings or the later chaos. They might have had misgivings about their monarch's strange power, but they were reluctant to sacrifice security for uncertainty. So they grumbled in private, then went back to their fields. But Sansa noticed something else. Caravans flowing northward, laden with supplies, grain, lumber, pitch, raw iron. King Jon had declared that the real seat of power would not remain in King's Landing forever. He was building up the north, fortifying the old castles near and around the wall, reinforcing them with new walls of stone. Thousands of laborers were carted north in these caravans, effectively impressed into service for the realm's defense, as the king's proclamations stated. Many were convicts or desperate peasants promised good coin, but others were simply told that it was their duty, that the king had commanded it. A portion of King's Landing's population vanished to the north, signing up for labor to avoid the black-cloaked enforcers who prowled the docks. Sansa recognized it as a form of conscription, an enormous project that consumed resources from all corners of Westeros. And no one dared refuse, for that would mean inviting the king's wrath. She often wondered why Jon was so intent on fortifying the north now that the White Walkers were destroyed. Occasionally, she tried to bring it up with him in the private chambers he had assigned her, but their conversations usually ended in the same, frustrating way. One such evening, Sansa was seated in a small solar lit by a single lantern. A faint wind drifted through the window, carrying the scents of the Blackwater Bay. Jon arrived unannounced, accompanied by 2 silent guards who stationed themselves at the door. He wore heavy boots and a dark tunic embroidered with the direwolf shadow sigil. The silver in his hair caught the lantern's glow as he removed his cloak and draped it over the back of a chair. "Sansa," he said in greeting, his tone subdued, as though weighed down by an unspoken burden. "Your Grace," she answered with a formal curtsy, though the corners of her mouth tightened with displeasure. It still felt unnatural to address him so, but formality was the only safe approach these days. He motioned for her to sit, which she did, folding her hands in her lap. She noted how he paced restlessly by the window, his gaze shifting from the torchlit yard below to the starless sky above. "You wanted to speak with me," Jon said at last. "Speak." She braced herself. "I want to understand what's happening in the north. You're sending thousands of workers there, fortifying every keep near the wall. I've heard rumors of old keeps being restored, new structures rising from the ground. Are we expecting some new threat? The White Walkers are gone." She kept her tone careful, trying not to sound accusatory. Jon paused, turning his head just enough that she could see the rigid line of his jaw. "The White Walkers are gone," he agreed. "But the North remains the first line of defense for the realm. We can't allow the wildlands beyond the wall to remain desolate. We must ensure no new terror grows in that cold darkness. We must be prepared for anything else that might emerge." He said it with the same stony conviction he used in every pronouncement of late. Yet Sansa sensed there was more to it, something personal in the way he alluded to the far north. She frowned. "You speak as if you expect a new enemy to appear at any moment. Could the others truly return?" She watched him carefully. His face was half in shadow, but she caught the faint flicker of tension around his eyes. "One must never be complacent," he answered. "The realm stands because of vigilance. If not the others, there could be other threats, things older than the White Walkers or shadows from across the sea. I won't be caught off guard." His words pricked her curiosity. "Shadows from across the sea? Do you mean the Red Priests in Essos? Or the Dothraki hordes?" Back in the days when Daenerys Targaryen had threatened the mainland, the idea of an Essosi invasion had carried weight. But Daenerys was long gone, her dragons and armies scattered or destroyed in the wars preceding the Long Night. No other Targaryens remained to claim the throne. Jon shook his head minutely. "I speak of no one in particular, only the unknown. We must keep the realm united and strong. The North will be our bulwark, protected by a loyal population with no illusions about the cost of survival." Sansa's chest tightened. She recalled how the free folk, who had once roamed those lands freely, had seen their entire way of life extinguished, replaced by forced settlements under Jon's watch. "Jon," she said softly, her voice tinged with sorrow, "the people do love you, in their own way, but they also fear you. The entire realm is under your thrall. Is that truly the only way to keep them safe?" He stilled, the muscles in his neck taut. "I don't enthrall them unnecessarily. You've seen what war does. Innocents slaughtered, armies tearing each other apart for claims of lords who do not care. This realm has known only suffering from its petty kings and queens. Now there's order. We have peace. and I will maintain it." With a trembling inhale, she looked away, letting a silence settle between them. She understood, better than anyone, that the old honorable Jon who had once insisted on fairness and freedom might never return. She decided to prod a little further, ignoring the chill in her spine. "There are rumors in the Red Keep, Jon. Disappearances. Prisoners vanish. Servants whisper they hear screams in the depths of the keep at night. Blood rituals. I've heard talk that you need them to feed something inside you." He turned sharply, and for a moment, the candlelight caught his eyes, making them look almost black. "You believe base rumors? Or do you think me some kind of monster?" The edge in his voice froze her in place. She forced herself not to recoil. "I don't want to believe them," she said, barely above a whisper. "I want to believe my brother would never." He cut her off in a low murmur. "Winter demanded its price, Sansa. If there are criminals who vanish from the dungeons, it's because they served no place in this new order. I do what must be done to protect the realm. That is all you need to know." She swallowed hard. This was a side of him she had seen glimpses of, but rarely so starkly. A side that terrified her more than Ramsay or Joffrey ever had, because this was Jon, someone she had once trusted with her life. "I understand," she said, though her voice wavered. "Thank you for your candor." He inclined his head in a curt nod. "We are Starks," he said, voice quiet. "We've survived so much. Trust that I still act for the good of all." With that, he turned and strode to the door, the two guards opening it for him. He left Sansa alone, the door's echo reverberating through the solar like a judge's gavel. She realized her heart was pounding. Had she pushed him too far? But no, she had to at least try to understand this darkness that was devouring him from within. If there was any hope of pulling him back, even a sliver, she needed to keep these lines of communication open. She stared at the fading light of her lamp, wondering if she was clinging to a foolish dream. Could this monstrous reign truly be undone, or at least softened, without plunging the realm into chaos again? Days passed. Sansa continued to play the courteous royal lady, hosting small gatherings, ensuring the lords and ladies of the Crownlands felt heard. She made sure the city functioned. Grain distribution, water cleanliness, roads, all the bureaucratic tasks that a well-run capital required. Jon's might overshadowed everything else, but there was still a need for day-to-day management. Sansa filled that role, quietly making sure King's Landing neither starved nor rebelled. She was aware Jon's watchers followed her now, men with dark expressions who lingered near every corridor. She did not try to evade them. Let them see that she was no threat, merely a dutiful sister serving the king's interests. And so it was for nearly 2 years, a simmering tension masked by outward stability. But the world beyond did not stay silent. Word reached the capital that a series of skirmishes had erupted along the Iron Islands. The lords there, always a fractious lot, resented the overwhelming presence of the king's black-clad enforcers, who had tried to impose heavier tributes of ships and men to support the Royal Navy. A certain Lord Ironmaker had apparently declared that the Ironborn bowed to no king, not even one who slew the Night King. Raids started along the western coasts of the north, burning small villages and harassing supply lines. Jon's soldiers responded with brutal efficiency, capturing or killing the raiders. But the tension flared, threatening a larger conflict. When these tidings reached Jon, he convened a council of his closest advisors, though in truth the word council was misleading, since few dared to offer real dissent. Sansa attended, as did Lord Glover of Deepwood Motte, a handful of subservient lords from the Crownlands, and 2 of Jon's highest captains, men who had come from the Free Folk but now wore the black crest of Jon's empire. They gathered around a large table in the throne room, torches casting long shadows on the walls. Jon listened to the accounts of Ironborn aggression with a stony expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost cold. "We have tolerated the Iron Islands so long as they offered men and ships without question. If they choose to test us, they will learn the folly of resisting." Lord Glover ventured a cautious comment. "Your Grace, the Ironborn are proud. They fear you, but their entire culture is built on defiance. They may never truly bend. Perhaps we could negotiate a lighter tribute. John's gaze snapped to Glover's face. A flicker of that intangible menace passed through the air. Negotiate? Have the long centuries of their lawless raiding taught you nothing? If they prefer to keep rebelling, they will be subdued. Permanently. Glover paled, bowing his head. Yes, Your Grace. I meant no disrespect. John exhaled, moderating his tone. Gather a fleet. I will accompany them personally. Once the Ironborn see me lead the assault, they will capitulate or die. A hush followed. It was the first time in months John had declared he would ride out to war himself. Sansa felt her pulse spike with anxiety. A show of force from John could lead to annihilation for the Iron Islands. He would enthrall or massacre them. There would be no middle ground. Thus, orders were dispatched with frightening speed. War galleys assembled in the harbor of King's Landing, black sails bearing the king's sigil. Men from the Crownlands and Stormlands marched or sailed for the southwestern coast to rendezvous with northern forces. Rumor said John would take personal command from the largest warship, a monstrous vessel fitted with scorpions and catapults for siege. In the city, people watched the preparations anxiously. Though few cared for the Ironborn, there was a broader sense that if any region openly defied King John, the retribution would be swift and brutal. Before departing, John visited the godswood he had created in the Red Keep's courtyard. An ancient weirwood trunk had been transplanted at great effort from the Wolfswood near Winterfell, its bark contorted with a carved face that looked perpetually mournful. In the hush of early dawn, John placed a bloody offering at the tree's roots, a small caged bird he had ordered from the castle's kitchens. He whispered a prayer to the old gods, or to the being that lived in his blood, letting the creature's life drain onto the white bark. The face on the tree seemed almost to shift, as though tasting the life that spilled. John felt a jolt of renewed energy course through his veins. The shadow inside him stirred, reminding him of its presence, reminding him that power must always be fueled. That morning, Sansa stood on the battlements, watching as John's fleet unfurled sails on Blackwater Bay. Soldiers lined the decks, archers and catapults bristling. At the prow of the flagship, she could make out John's dark silhouette. He did not wave farewell. He simply stood there, solitary, as the wind carried the ships toward the open sea. A strange pang went through her heart, the memory of the brother who had once parted from her so tenderly when he joined the Night's Watch. Now he was a distant figure, commanding armies with a wave of his hand. She wondered if he would return having conquered the Iron Islands, or burned them to the ground. Days bled into weeks. Ravens brought sparse updates to King's Landing. The king's fleet had reached the Sunset Sea. The Ironborn tried a series of lightning raids, but King John easily repelled them. Reports told of entire Ironborn crews falling to their knees in terror as John appeared on the deck of his warship, black aura swirling around him. Some claimed that at Pike itself, the seat of House Greyjoy, the castle gates opened the moment John's ships appeared on the horizon. A group of Ironborn lords came out, stumbling over themselves to bend the knee. Yet others fought to the last, refusing to yield. Then came the final raven. Pike was taken. The largest holdfasts on the major isles were subdued. Lord Ironmaker, the leader of the rebellion, had been seized and brought before John. The official record stated that King John offered the man a choice: immediate surrender or a swift death. The Ironborn refused. He and his followers were publicly executed on the beach, their blood fed to the waves in a macabre ritual that turned the sea foam red. Over a dozen lesser Ironborn captains took the knee under the king's gaze. Rumor said John enthralled their chieftains to ensure no further rebellion would stir. Thus ended the uprising of the Iron Islands. In less than a moon's turn, it was over. An entire region, proud and fierce, was shackled beneath the king's will. Not long after, John returned to King's Landing, where the populace greeted him with a subdued reverence. The success of the campaign confirmed his near-mythic stature. No corner of Westeros could stand against him. Lords from every region quietly digested the lesson. Defiance was futile. They would comply with his rule, or they would vanish like the Ironborn rebel leaders. Whispers in the street repeated the new slogan that had arisen among Jon's followers: one king, one realm, one purpose. Sansa felt a heavy weight settle in her chest as she watched the city greet Jon's triumph. How many or times could regions be threatened, subjugated, or enthralled? Where would it end? She found herself turning to her handmaid, a timid girl from the Westerlands named Mela, in hopes of gleaning how the common folk truly felt. They say the king is unstoppable, Mela murmured, braiding Sansa's hair one evening, and that the old gods chose him to lead us through winter and beyond. Her eyes darted about, as though fearing someone might overhear. Some are grateful, my lady. Others, well, they're afraid. They say it's not right for one man to have such power. Sansa nodded slightly, meeting Mela's gaze in the mirror. They're not wrong to be afraid, she said in a near whisper. But we mustn't speak of it outside this room. Do you understand? Mela swallowed, eyes wide. Yes, my lady. Their hushed conversation reflected a broader undercurrent. Across the realm, Jon's total dominance was settling in like permafrost. Some accepted it, some chafed under it, but no open rebellion formed, for fear of being crushed before it gained strength. Seasons shifted again. A new winter storm threatened far away in the shivering sea, but Westeros itself began to see a fragile spring. Gardens in the Reach flourished, aided by a stable supply of farmhands. The new roads built by Jon's labor conscriptions cut travel times between major cities, improving commerce. Children grew up never knowing the terror of White Walkers or the chaos of feuding kings. To them, Jon Snow was the only monarch, a figure of legend who had risen from the Night's Watch to banish the undead. They repeated songs in which Jon was a savior blessed by the old gods. And Jon continued his secret rituals. The monthly blood sacrifices done in lonely corners of the Red Keep's dungeons, or in the Gods' Wood by moonlight. The entity that lived within him, the coalescence of ancient forest power and the vestiges of the Night King, never slept. It reminded him again and again that to maintain dominion, to prevent the reemergence of any threat, he must feed it. Criminals, traitors, sometimes even the unclaimed bodies of plague victims. Always something had to be offered. Each time, Jon felt a mixture of disgust and grim necessity. Even so, he did not stop. The power in his blood had become essential to maintaining absolute rule. At night, he sometimes dreamed of Tormund's face twisted in betrayal, or the wide, frightened eyes of men sacrificed on altars. The ghosts hovered at the edges of his consciousness. Yet each morning, he woke with renewed resolve. The realm was safe, stable, and at peace. Any price was justified to preserve that. One night, however, his sacrifice did not go as planned. He descended to the dungeons in the hour before dawn, accompanied only by one silent guard. Torches flickered on the damp stone walls. Rats scurried away, squeaking. A prisoner, an old Sellsword who had murdered 3 men, was chained in a far cell. Jon's guard dragged the trembling man forth, forcing him onto a rough stone slab. Jon drew a small, curved blade from his belt, a blade carved from a dragonglass handle with Valyrian steel embedded in its edge. He placed the tip at the Sellsword's throat. But as he began the incantation, muttering the old words he had pieced together from runes and memories older than men, something stirred in the corner of the dungeon. A form slid from the shadows. Ghost, the white direwolf, grown lean from wandering the corridors. Ghost let out a low, rumbling growl, hackles raised. Jon froze, knife pressed against the prisoner's jugular, turning to meet the direwolf's ember-red eyes. Ghost had avoided Jon for years, refusing to be near him. Yet now here he was, in the bowels of the keep, intervening. A swirl of emotions crashed through Jon's mind. Regret, anger, longing, guilt. The bond they once shared had never fully died. They were both children of the North, tied by something deep. But Jon had forcibly severed that bond when he embraced the darkness. The direwolf, however, had never abandoned his knowledge of what Jon once was, and what he had become. "Ghost," Jon said, voice taut with strain. "Go away." Ghost's snarl only deepened, saliva glistening on his fangs. In the dim torchlight, his fur seemed to glow. The cell's word trembled on the slab, choking back sobs. John's guard shifted nervously, looking to John for orders. Slowly, John lifted the blade from the prisoner's throat and turned fully to face the direwolf. The presence within him flared, urging him to quell this challenge. He felt a pulse of power radiate from his chest, enveloping the chamber. In the past, that wave had subdued animals and men alike. But Ghost stood firm, unaffected, his golden-red eyes locked on John, brimming with a fierce, desperate sorrow. For a heartbeat, man and wolf stared each other down. It was as though Ghost was refusing to let John commit this act, refusing to let him sink another inch deeper into damnation. A tremor ran through John's hand, the dagger trembling. He saw images in rapid succession. Ghost as a pup, clinging to him in the snows outside Winterfell. Tormund's dying gaze, the swirl of power in the Weirwood cave, the undone illusions of his old life. Guilt frothed up in him like acid. For a moment, it felt as though the entire dungeon grew too small to contain the two of them. If ghosts of the past were real, this was the moment when Jon's final tether to his humanity returned to confront him. Jon Snow. The cell's word whimpered, "Mercy, please." Jon tore his gaze from Ghost, swallowing the lump of emotion. He gestured to his guard. "Remove the prisoner to another cell." His voice sounded raw, like something scraping across stone. "Now." The guard blinked, uncertain. "Your Grace, they..." "Do it," Jon snarled. An edge of that lethal compulsion underpinned his words, making the guard flinch and scurry to comply. The prisoner was dragged from the slab, his chains rattling. Ghost watched them go, but his focus remained on Jon. As soon as the guard and prisoner vanished around a bend in the corridor, the direwolf let out a long, low whine. Slowly, Jon lowered the dagger. The flickering torchlight cast shifting shadows on the walls, and in that uncertain glow, he reached out his free hand, palm open. Ghost took a hesitant step forward, his growl subsiding. Jon's heart pounded in his ears. He was momentarily dizzy, as if the swirling darkness in him recoiled from the direwolf's purity. Another small step, and Ghost's muzzle brushed Jon's fingers. It was the first time in years they had touched without hostility. A wild surge of emotion nearly blinded Jon. Guilt, sorrow, yearning for some innocence he had lost. He sank to one knee, letting Ghost's warm breath wash over him, letting the direwolf's thick fur meet his shaking hand. How many nights had he dreamed of this moment, only to awaken in a bed cold and empty? He started, but words failed him. He simply looked into Ghost's eyes, searching for condemnation, forgiveness, or both. The direwolf's gaze flickered, ancient and wise in ways humans weren't. Another whine, and Ghost pressed his forehead to Jon's chest. For the span of a heartbeat, Jon felt the old bond hum between them. Ghost was letting him know that a piece of Jon Snow still existed, the man who had once cherished loyalty and honor above all. A choking sob threatened to escape Jon's throat. He clutched Ghost's fur, burying his face against the direwolf's neck, inhaling the scent of musk and old fur. Time seemed to stop, but then the darkness inside him coiled like a serpent, reminding him that he had obligations, that the power required constant nourishment, that a single moment of weakness could unravel everything he had built. He clenched his jaw, fighting a bitter war within himself. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, but he did not let them fall. "We can't go back," Jon whispered, voice raw. "You know that, Ghost. What I've done, there's no undoing it." The direwolf made a small noise, pressing closer. Jon's hand trembled, and the dagger clattered to the stones. "I am the king. I've saved the realm. I have to keep it safe. It means I must remain what I am." Ghost pulled back slightly, his ears flicking in a signal of alarm. For an instant, it looked like he might bare his teeth again. But after a tense moment, he settled, gazing at Jon with the same eyes that had once peered into his soul under the moonlight at the wall. If the direwolf could speak, perhaps he would have said, "At least remember who you were." The torches sputtered. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, the guard returning. At the sound, Ghost whirled, then, with a swift and silent bound, disappeared into the darkness. The guard emerged, alone and clearly unnerved by the entire tableau. John rose, wiping any trace of vulnerability from his face. He retrieved the dagger, sheathing it without a word. Then, in a voice cold as winter, he ordered the guard to fetch another prisoner. Yet, when he was left alone again, dagger in hand, John found he could not continue. The impetus, the dread desire to feed the darkness, had been shaken by Ghost's reappearance. With a snarl, John forced the blade back into its scabbard. "Not tonight," he muttered to the empty air, feeling the power within him churn restlessly. Then he strode from the dungeons, his footsteps echoing in the gloom. That night, John roamed the corridors of the Red Keep without any destination, ignoring the guards who bowed at his passing. Eventually, he found himself in the deserted throne room. Moonlight streamed through high windows, illuminating the twisted metal of the Iron Throne. He ascended the dais, trailing his fingers across the cold steel, half lost in thought. The hall was silent enough that he could hear his own breathing. His mind spun with the memory of Ghost's eyes. He remembered Tormund's laughter, Ygritte's fierce voice telling him he knew nothing, the gentle sincerity of Samwell Tarly's friendship, the earnestness of the vows he once spoke before a weirwood in the north. Where had that man gone? He sat on the Iron Throne, a man alone in the dark, and closed his eyes. The power he wielded whispered that all regrets were meaningless. He had done what was necessary, had destroyed the White Walkers and united the realm. But Ghost's silent judgment lingered. Eventually, the faint glow of dawn touched the sky. Servants started stirring in distant corridors. John left the throne room unseen, disappearing into his private chambers. He slept fitfully, plagued by half-remembered dreams of the wind-swept north, the old gods Wood in Winterfell, and the face of his father Eddard Stark, regarding him with quiet sadness. Life continued. The next day, the same tasks awaited him. Appointments with lords seeking favor, pronouncements regarding trade routes in the Narrow Sea, messages from the new strongholds in the north. John performed his kingly duties with the same measured efficiency as ever, but something had shifted within him. He found himself tarrying when it came to the hush of midnight, reluctant to return to the dungeons. Instead, he spent more evenings stalking the halls, sometimes even checking if Ghost lurked in some corner. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of white fur turning a corner, but whenever he arrived, the corridor was empty. He knew that ignoring the darkness within was not an option. It demanded its due, yet he put it off day by day. An entire moon's turn passed without a sacrifice in King's Landing. He told himself that criminals were still executed in the usual fashion, and that was enough. But the old magic was not satisfied. Twice, in the black of night, he woke to a searing pain in his chest, as though an icy blade drove straight through his heart. He staggered, drenched in sweat, feeling the presence thrash in protest. He forced it down, forced it to submit, reminding it that he was no mere thrall to the old gods. He was their champion, the one who had consumed the Night King. If he withheld blood for a time, it was his will. Yet the cost was visible. His nightmares worsened, his temper grew shorter, and the men around him grew uneasy. In council sessions, his eyes would flicker with an angry darkness at the slightest sign of hesitation. Even his enthralled captains seemed nervous. Perhaps they sensed that this tension could erupt. Then, like a tinder spark landing on dry grass, a new rumor spread through the city. Daenerys Targaryen might still live. A group of exiled lords from Essos claimed that the last Targaryen queen, who had vanished after her defeat in the war preceding the Long Night, had taken refuge across the Narrow Sea and was now rallying what remained of her forces to challenge Jon's rule. Most dismissed the rumor as nonsense. Daenerys's dragons had all perished, and her armies were scattered to the winds. Yet the rumor persisted, capturing imaginations. A dragon queen returning to depose a shadow king. Jon treated it with scorn, but he ordered his spy network to investigate. The truth soon emerged. Some rebellious lords from the Crownlands and the Stormlands had fled with a handful of men to Essos, possibly in search of mercenary companies or any Targaryen pretender. That alone might not have amounted to much, but it was enough to set Jon on edge. If any figure, real or false, crowned themselves in Daenerys's name, it could spark discontent among those who still revered the Targaryen mystique. Even without dragons, the Targaryen line had a certain mythic power in the minds of men. Sansa learned of Jon's concerns through snatches of conversation in the corridors. She saw him conferring with his black-cloaked captains, ordering more fleets to patrol the narrow sea, setting watch in every port. King's Landing tightened further under his grip, as if he feared infiltration from beyond. The tension in the air became palpable. The rumor stoked the imaginations of the small folk, who whispered that if a Targaryen arrived at the city gates, perhaps the king's hold would waver. Some, ironically, yearned for any challenger to break the unrelenting dominion of the Shadow King. But no Targaryen came. Summer burned on, scorching the fields around the Blackwater. Life seemed to plod forward as it had for the last few years. Jon's watchers flushed out a handful of conspirators who had been hoarding weapons in a warehouse near Flea Bottom. They were executed in the public square. The crowd watched with stony faces as the conspirators, pale and trembling, pleaded for mercy. Jon's eyes were colder than ice when he commanded the archers to fire. That night, he felt another pang of that malignant magic in his chest, as if punishing him for not performing the sacrifice in the old manner. He took a breath, forced it under control. The longing to see Ghost again warred with the knowledge that he was playing a dangerous game by not feeding the darkness. Sooner or later, he would have to choose. A day later, as he paced restlessly in his solar, a raven arrived from the citadel in Old Town. It bore an unusual message, marked with a secret sigil used by Samwell Tarly, who had risen in rank among the maesters. Jon read the letter in silence. "Jon, I have heard troubling rumors of what's become of the realm under your rule. I do not know how much is truth or falsehood, but many accounts concern your enthrallment of men and your dark sorcery. I recall the man I knew at Castle Black, a man of honor who fought to protect all the living, including the free folk. If that man yet remains, I beg you to heed my words. I've uncovered references in the oldest tomes to a method of severing a mortal man from an ancient power that has bound itself to him. The instructions are fragmentary, but mention the draining of the king's blood and an act of contrition at the place where the bond was forged. If any part of you yearns to be free of this shadow, contact me. I will come in secret and bring what knowledge I can. Remember who you are. Your friend, Samwell Tarly." Jon's hands shook, the parchment rustling. Samwell Tarly, the faithful friend, had discovered a possible way to sever the hold of this old god's power. A swirl of emotions battered Jon's mind. Relief, dread, anger, longing. Could it be that simple? The letter was frustratingly vague, but if Sam had references, if a ritual truly existed to undo what he had done in that weirwood cave, he sank into a chair, letting out a ragged breath. Memories flooded him. Tormund's trusting grin, the nights at Castle Black when Sam would read old books by candlelight, the vow they made to defend the realms of men. For a moment, the thought of being free from the unholy contract nearly undid him. Yet, just as quickly, fear clamped down on his heart. If he severed himself from this power, would the realm collapse into chaos? Would enemies strike immediately, sense his weakness, and plunge the Seven Kingdoms into war once more? He stared at the letter for a long time. The presence inside him throbbed with anger, as if it sensed he was considering betrayal. A headache pulsed behind his eyes. He clenched his jaw, tears of frustration threatening. Everything he had done, all the blood spilled, the atrocities committed, would that all be for nothing if he cast aside the power? Or was continuing to rule through fear simply a cycle that would never end? Eventually, he tore the letter into tiny fragments and cast them into the fireplace. The old gods whispered, hungry and insistent. Jon resolved to bury the thought for the time being. Sam's dream of a cure would have to wait. The realm needed stability, and stability required a king strong enough to enforce it, no matter the cost. Life carried on. More months slipped by, and the rumor of Daenerys Targaryen's survival fizzled into little more than a cautionary tale. Sansa busied herself with administering the city, ensuring food and coin flowed. She maintained a delicate dance, never overtly opposing Jon, but refusing to become a silent accomplice to his darkest actions. She noticed that the city's nights were quieter than ever. Few ventured out after dark. There was a sense that something prowled the shadows, a hush that even the whores and sellswords felt in their bones. Ghost made sporadic appearances in the Red Keep, haunting the corridors like a restless spirit. A handful of times, Sansa glimpsed the white direwolf's shape outside her chambers in the hush before dawn, as if he were guarding her from some unseen threat. She had grown bolder around him, once murmuring, "Ghost, if you could speak, what would you say? Can Jon still be saved?" The wolf had only stared at her with those eerie red eyes before padding silently away. But somehow, his presence gave her a shred of hope, that not all compassion was lost in the cold fortress of power that Jon had built. Despite that faint hope, the darkness had not receded from Jon. If anything, it had grown more volatile from his reluctance to perform the old sacrifices. He found himself subject to waves of fury or moments of black despair when he was alone. He would clench the arms of his throne so hard that his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to maintain control in front of his court. The old god's hunger never went away. It gnawed at him, a living worm in his brain, demanding the old rites. And so, inevitably, he gave in. One night, he ordered the darkest ceremony yet, a secret midnight gathering in the Godswood with half a dozen convicted criminals. Blood was spilled upon the roots of the transplanted weirwood, and that ancient bark drank it eagerly. Jon felt a shiver of loathing at himself, but also a twisted relief that the hunger abated. The next day, his eyes were ringed with shadows, though he carried himself with renewed composure. The cycle continued. Year by year, this became the norm of Westeros, a paradoxical time of peace and fear. The roads were safe, yet free speech was stifled. Harvests were bountiful in many regions, yet the people lived under an ever-present hush, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Revolts were minor, quickly suppressed. In the north, vast fortifications continued to rise at Eastwatch and Shadow Tower, each manned by legions of black-clad soldiers and reluctant free folk. Rumor said entire subterranean networks were being carved beneath the wall, forging a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels. Some whispered that Jon was preparing for a war against an enemy that did not yet exist. Others said he was building a personal stronghold so deep it might rival the ancient Greenseers of legend. Sansa, tethered to King's Landing as the realm's royal lady, watched all this with an ever-growing sense of dread. She had tried to counsel Jon with reason and compassion, but found him increasingly distant. The small fragments of empathy he'd shown in the past, such as letting the sellsword live that night in the dungeon, seemed to be overshadowed by repeated demands of the crown. Even her presence at court had become a formality. She was a symbol of continuity between House Stark and the monarchy, but her voice held little sway. Late one evening, she was in her chambers, reading by lamplight, when a timid knock at her door drew her attention. She set aside her book and opened the door to find Mela trembling on the threshold, wringing her hands. "My lady," Mela whispered, "forgive me, but there's a situation in the courtyard." Sansa followed Mela down winding stairs until they reached a small upper gallery overlooking the Red Keep's main courtyard. The torchlit square below was not as deserted as usual. Two of Jon's black-cloaked officers stood with a group of men in travel-worn cloaks. The men, it seemed, had just arrived by night, which was unusual. Another officer carried a lantern, shining it in the travelers' faces. Sansa strained to hear the conversation. "Just come from Essos," one of the men said, voice resonating with a foreign accent. "We bring news that concerns the king. Urgent news about an army gathering across the sea." The words caught Sansa's attention. An army in Essos? Could the Targaryen rumor be springing to life again? The travelers seemed exhausted, their cloaks patched with dust. They looked like the sort of mercenary scouts or sell-sale captains who might have knowledge of foreign movements. The black-cloaked officers questioned them briefly, then escorted them inside the keep. Sansa lingered in the shadows, suspecting that these men would soon be brought before Jon. She was proven correct. An hour later, a small hush fell over the corridors. Curious, Sansa drifted near the throne room's entrance, flanked by Mela. She overheard the echo of raised voices within. The King's Guard, posted outside, said nothing to bar her way. Whether it was an oversight or an intentional choice, she slipped quietly through the doors and positioned herself near a stone pillar in the gloom, her presence mostly hidden. Inside, the throne room's torches burned low, casting dancing shadows. Jon was on the Iron Throne, wearing a black tunic stitched with swirling patterns of silver thread. His gaze was fixed on the group of newly arrived men. One of them, a tall figure with close-cropped dark hair, knelt before the throne. His voice wavered with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Your Grace, we sailed from Volantis under a secret contract," he said. "We've been tracking rumors of the Golden Company's movements. Word is that a new claimant has arisen, someone who claims both Targaryen and Valyrian blood. They've apparently secured enough gold to hire not only the Golden Company but several other Sellsword bands. They're forging alliances, building ships. Some say they have war elephants. Others talk of newly hatched dragons. But..." He hesitated, glancing anxiously at Jon's face. "We saw no dragons ourselves." Jon's jaw tightened. "Another pretender. We've heard such rumors before, and none have borne fruit. Why should I believe your story is different?" The man swallowed. "Your Grace, we wouldn't have risked our lives to come here if it wasn't serious. The Golden Company is more united than we've seen in a generation. Led by a commander who calls himself Rhaegar's heir. He claims he's the son of Rhaegar Targaryen's bloodline, though we haven't confirmed how. Perhaps it's all lies, but the Sellswords believe it. They're massing near the stepstones, waiting for the right moment to sail west." Beside him, one of the other travelers nodded vigorously. "We overheard talk that they plan to land in Dorne. The Prince of Dorne is resentful. He never truly accepted your rule after the last purge of rebels." A hiss of frustration escaped Jon's lips. He rose from the throne, the black cloak swirling around his legs. "I stabilized Dorne years ago. Their lords bent the knee. Why would they risk everything now to support a Targaryen pretender?" Silence. The travelers exchanged uneasy looks. Finally, the tall one spoke again. "Because, Your Grace, a Targaryen-led invasion might be seen as a return to the old ways, or at least a chance to break free from the fear that grips the realm. We, beg your pardon, Your Grace, we only report what we've heard." Jon stared down at them, his eyes cold as the winter sea. Sansa tensed behind the pillar. She recalled the years of rumor about Targaryen survivors. If there was any real attempt at invasion, it could spark the unthinkable. A new war that might engulf the realm. Jon, for all his monstrous power, could find himself forced into open conflict on the beaches of Dorne, dragging the entire continent into bloodshed. Would the darkness in him ascend to even greater heights of horror to quell such an uprising? One of Jon's black-cloaked officers stepped forward. "Your Grace, if I may, we can easily dispatch a fleet to the Stepstones and burn them out before they land. If the Golden Company is assembling ships, we strike first." Another officer countered. "We risk forcing them into an alliance with other powers. If we move too soon, the free cities might side against us. Better to let them land, then crush them on our territory." Jon said nothing for a moment. Sansa's heartbeat quickened. She could see tension lines near Jon's eyes, the darkness coiling, seeking an outlet. Ghost's reappearance had shaken him. Sam's letter had stirred old guilt, and now a Targaryen pretender threatened everything he'd built. If he let fear or rage guide him, the realm would drown in blood. At length, Jon's voice cut through the hush like a blade. "We will not wait for them to grow stronger. Send envoys to Dorne at once. If the Prince of Dorne is plotting treason, we'll learn of it. I want the entire southern coast reinforced. Summon more forces from the north if needed. Prepare the Royal Navy. No one crosses the narrow sea without my leave." His officers bowed. Jon turned his gaze back to the travelers. "For your service, you shall be rewarded. But if you've deceived me about any of this, I'll know. And you will regret it." They swallowed, bowing low, murmuring fervent thanks and assurances of truth. Jon lifted a hand in dismissal. The men were ushered out under the watchful eyes of guards. Jon remained, fists clenched at his sides, his expression carved from stone. The throne room was silent except for the crackling of torches. That was when Jon spoke quietly, though there was no one in front of him. "A Targaryen pretender with the Golden Company, and Dorne uncertain. So be it." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Sansa thought she saw him sway with weariness. She took a step from behind the pillar, letting her presence be known. "Jon," she said softly. He opened his eyes, turning, no surprise on his face. Perhaps he had sensed her all along. "Sansa," he acknowledged. "You heard." She nodded. "A threat from across the sea?" He took a slow breath, crossing the floor toward her. Another distraction, another potential war. His gaze flicked past her, as if scanning the shadows. "I've had enough of usurpers. The realm is mine." She studied him, finding the faintest tremor in his stance. "It is, but must everything be solved with blood? Maybe a diplomatic approach? If the Golden Company is motivated by a false Targaryen, show them it's a lie. Offer them terms." His expression hardened. "That's your suggestion? Invite them to parley, treat them like rightful claimants? We tried that approach in wars past. It led only to betrayal and more death." Sansa swallowed. "But more war. Jon, so many have died already. If you press too harshly, you risk driving half the realm into rebellion out of fear alone." A flicker of old frustration twisted his features. He closed the distance, his eyes glinting with an intensity that made her stiffen. "Fear keeps them in line. Do you think the realm would remain at peace if they were left to their own devices? You saw the War of the Five Kings. You saw how the Ironborn rose. You saw the unrest in Dorne. Tell me, sister, who else can lead them all?" She hesitated. "No one," she admitted. But what? You think I should show them my throat and beg for mercy if they rebel?" His voice shook slightly, whether from anger or some deeper pain. "You haven't seen what I've seen, Sansa. I looked upon the face of absolute death. I destroyed the Night King. I remember Hardhome. I remember the dead rising from the sea. I know the horrors that could return if this realm descends into chaos again." He gestured violently, as if trying to banish the memory. "So if I must use fear to keep them united, I will. Let them hate me if they must. At least they're alive to do so." Silence fell. She saw how his breath came faster, the cords in his neck tight. He was telling the truth in his own way. He believed that only unyielding dominion stood between Westeros and anarchy. Or perhaps he needed to believe it to justify what he had become. Quietly, gently, she reached out and touched his forearm. "I don't want you to suffer," she said, voice trembling. "I only wish there was another way." He stared at her hand on his arm. For a moment, a flash of pain crossed his eyes. Then he pulled away, stepping back, cloaking himself in that unassailable composure once more. "Go. Get some rest, Sansa. There's much to be done. If this Targaryen pretender crosses the narrow sea, I'll meet them with all the power at my command." She let her hand fall to her side. A sad smile touched her lips. "As you will, your grace." Turning, she departed the throne room. His footsteps did not follow. She felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall in a place where the guards or courtiers might see. Let them see only the Lady of Winterfell, strong and poised. The time for tears had passed long ago. Alone again, Jon ascended the steps to the Iron Throne. He sank onto its twisted metal seat and stared into the darkness. A numbness spread through him. Another war was coming. He could feel it like a cold wind on the back of his neck. The old gods within him stirred, whispering that soon more sacrifices would be needed, more displays of might. If the Golden Company dared land on Westeros' shores, he would crush them. He had done it before, again and again, with the Ironborn, with rebellious houses, with any who defied him. He was the king of the Seven Kingdoms, and he would remain so no matter the cost. Yet the memory of Ghost's eyes, the tang of Sam's letter, and the sight of Sansa's sorrowful face all pressed on him. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the faint, rhythmic pulse of the presence he had invited into himself. A Targaryen-led threat might force his hand, drive him to new extremes of cruelty. Would this final test push him beyond all remnants of the man he once was? Did that man even still exist? He closed his eyes and whispered to the darkness, "Just a little longer." He did not clarify whether he was speaking to his old self or to the unholy spirit that had fused with him. The torch flames guttered in the sudden draft, and the glint of steel on the throne seemed to laugh in the gloom, as though mocking the lonely king who had betrayed the free folk, bound the realm in fear, and now stood on the brink of another cataclysmic war. Across the narrow sea, in the harbor of Volantis, ships gathered under golden banners. Officers drilled fresh recruits in swordplay and pike maneuvers. Plumes of dust rose from the training yards as men in polished half-plate practiced cavalry charges. In a grand tent embroidered with an unfamiliar sigil, a three-headed dragon entwined with a silver seahorse, a figure in a dark cloak studied a map of Westeros by candlelight. Murmured voices spoke of an unyielding king who had banished winter's horrors but become a tyrant in the process. Whispers passed from mouth to ear that now was the time to restore the rightful bloodline, to end the reign of shadows. Far to the north, in the Frostfangs, the wind howled around the black cave where once Jon Snow had bargained with an ancient entity for power. Snow-laden trees bent under the gale, and the weirwood that stood twisted above that ravine wept red sap into the drifts. It was a place of old, hungry magic, a place that remembered blood spilled on its roots. Something stirred in that darkness, sensing the tensions rising across the sea, sensing the heartbeat of its chosen vessel in King's Landing. The tapestry of fate tightened its threads. In King's Landing itself, the small folk whispered about the possibility of new war. Some cowered, some hoarded supplies, and some dared to hope that if the Targaryen pretender arrived with enough force, it might break the unrelenting rule of the Shadow King. Others insisted that to challenge Jon Snow was to court annihilation, that he was unstoppable, an avatar of ancient gods. The city's nights felt more oppressive than ever. People saw ghosts in every alleyway and flinched at every creak of the wind. No one knew what shape the next few months would take, only that every rumor spoke of armies on the move, of ships setting sail, of watchers on the walls. Alone on the Iron Throne, Jon listened to the hush of the hall, aware of the eyes of his court upon him, aware that the realm stood poised for another wave of violence. He had once believed the true war had been won when the White Walkers were destroyed. Yet here he was, still fighting, still drowning the land in dread. And for what? A fleeting sense of security? He exhaled, letting the torches cast wavering shadows on his face. There would be no respite. Not until all threats were crushed, not until he could rule unchallenged, or until someone found the strength to break his hold over the realm. Even then, what would remain of him? The king who had bartered his soul in a weirwood cave and crowned himself in blood could never truly go back. But at the back of his mind, in the place beyond duty and beyond nightmares, he clung to a secret, flickering hope that perhaps, someday, he might atone. The night deepened, and the hush settled into every crevice of King's Landing. Ghost wandered the battlements, a silent sentinel, raising his muzzle to sniff the distant breeze. Sansa lay awake, heart heavy, in her chambers. Samwell Tarly scoured ancient texts in Old Town, preparing for a day when Jon might yet call on him. And in that hush of the darkest hour, Jon Snow stared at the empty throne room, burdened by the intangible weight of a crown he could neither remove nor share. He had climbed this peak to save them all, but at the top, the wind was cold and lonely, and the shadows never slept. When dawn broke, pink light touched the spires of the Red Keep. King Jon rose from the throne, his black cloak trailing behind him. He strode toward the council chamber to plan the defense of Westeros, to chart the paths of war. His footfalls echoed with the inevitability of fate, each step moving him further along a road where redemption and damnation were two edges of the same blade. Whether or not he would find a way to reclaim his lost self remained uncertain. The realm, in its uneasy hush, waited for the storms to come, and for the clash that might someday break the silence of a king who had betrayed the free folk to gain a power greater than winter itself.